Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another installment of the Frontiers International Plainfield Area Club's Westry Horne Cultural and Heritage Lecture Series. The occasion for today is one that is a stark reminder that as we continue to battle against the inequitable devastations of COVID-19, racial injustice, widespread division across our nation, and the loss of life at the hands of law enforcement, our prayers remain with the families of those who have lost loved ones or have otherwise been adversely impacted by these tragedies. Today, as we gather, we reside in an environment that is not much different than that in which Malcolm X himself lived. So as we jump into today's program, I'm eager to revisit the life and the legacy of Malcolm X such that we might extract key lessons that remain impactful in our lives today. Today, we have the distinct honor of having Baba Zayid Muhammad, who will be sharing with us in this critical moment of emerging greatness amongst our brothers and our sisters. In operation for over 60 years, the Frontiers International Plainfield Area Club, through our scholarship and educational programs, help to provide opportunities to local young people who wish to further their education beyond high school. We also host free seminars and workshops like this one to help educate and empower community members in key areas, including Black American history, financial literacy and wellness, and overall social justice. I encourage you to join us in our mission to provide advancement through service by donating to help further these initiatives. We are a 501c3 organization, and all qualified donations are tax deductible. So to donate, you can do so through Zelle using the phone number 732-470-4207, or through PayPal under our treasurer's email address, jess.marshall@verizon.net. Otherwise, you can also send a check made payable to Frontiers International Plainfield Area Club to P.O. Box 428, Plainfield, New Jersey, 07061. All gifts are certainly appreciated, and they will go toward all of the initiatives that I previously mentioned. 100% of those proceeds will go to impact the life of a young person in our communities. And on that note, let's jump right in. Join me in welcoming, if you will, yoke fellow John Brinkley. John, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad I have been able to join us for this someone who is very knowledgeable of him. I would like to introduce a good of the People's Organization for Progress, and Baba Zayid Muhammad has a radical activist profile of over 40 years. He is a proud cub of the Black Panther Party and the founding officer of New York's Malcolm X Commemorative Committee. He was recently featured in the critically acclaimed Netflix documentary, Who Killed Malcolm X? He recently became an associate producer of the Rutgers University Newark-based podcast, All Politics Are Local, launched by Edward Riley and Jonathan Alston. He is a stage actor and poet, currently working on two volumes of the soul poem, the soul poems, All Love and Rage, and We Ride, Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, and Those Who Dare. Currently, he is organizer for the or Newark Community Policing, an umbrella organization for the social justice organizations represented on Newark's groundbreaking new civilian review board over the Newark Police Department. Because of his fatherly bearing, young people taken to calling him Baba means father in Yoruba. So without further ado, let me introduce Brother Zayid Mohammed.
Whether he is guilty or whether he is innocent, whether he is well dressed or whether he is poorly dressed, whether he is educated or whether he is dumb, whether he's a Christian or whether he's a Muslim, as long as he is black and a member of the Negro community, the white public thinks that the white policeman is justified in going in there and trampling on that man's civil rights and on that man's human rights. Once the police have convinced the white public that the so-called Negro community is a criminal element, they can go in and question, brutalize, murder unarmed, innocent Negroes, and the white public is gullible enough to back them up. We declare our rank on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.
Okay. Welcome, Baba Zayid. My friend is yours. We are pleased to have you today, and I look forward to what you are going to share. The floor is yours, my friend.
Mic check, mic check. And everyone here okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, okay. Let me first say I wish this was not in virtual space, simply because I'm originally from Plainfield, New Jersey, and I've always wanted to do something like this in my hometown. What I want to do, John, and Sophia, is I'll just call some of these pictures out as we go along, so they can do what I need you to do. Let me say first and foremost that I'm very, very grateful and very proud and very humble that you would ask me to share with you on what is clearly my favorite subject. I'm glad we are revisiting Malcolm. We have more than one good reason to do that. We all stand to benefit from this revisit or revisiting Malcolm regularly. He is that kind of ancestor who was meant to be very present in our lives at a very challenging time. So I'm humbled that you would have me do that. Um, Plainfield, 414 East 6th Street and 750 East Front Street. Those are my Plainfield addresses. I'm gonna throw, if we can throw, there's a picture up that is simply called Uncle Glenn with my, throw the first two pictures up for me if you can, Sophia, and I'll just walk us through these. Right, that's the Second Street Youth Center, circa 1977, 78. The Second Street Youth Center was the home of the Second Street Youth Center boxing team, and at the top in the middle is a young knucklehead by the name of Tony Johnson, and he's standing next to one of the stars of that gym, and he's none other than Albert Steele Mills. That's right in the middle, right? The Second Street Youth Center boxing team that was a global construct. These young men went all over the world, literally representing this town in the dangerous sport of boxing in a very, very upstanding way. I would dare say that its principal trainer, you can go to the next one, its principal trainer was John Davenport. John Davenport happened to be my father's baby brother. And he, it's a picture that says Uncle Glenwood, if you can pull that up. It should be right next to it. No, not that one. Now you're going ahead. You're going ahead. Go back. There you go. The gentleman to the far left is John Davenport. He was a teaching master. He was the dean of boxing in this part of the country for decades. But that gym, what he did with that gym, he didn't just breed champions. He showed young black men and brown men how to become men. So I would dare say that the Second Street Youth Center and his boxing team under the tutelage of that man, and that's me on the far right with the glasses on, and we are taking care of one Glenwood Brown. Glenwood was one of our babies who would later get a shot at a title as a professional fighter. He was he was one of the best to come out of our gym. But Second Street Youth Center was a rite of passage from young brothers coming off the street to become men. So I'm very grateful for that experience. All of us who have been through it are grateful for it, and it's something that we also made our town somewhat proud in. And he was made sure that we carried ourselves in a very exemplary way. So he is the family ancestor who was my last link to this great town. Now the next picture is from a younger man in Plainfield. There you go, who was doing something that he asked me to be a part of that I want us all to appreciate. And I'm really doing this for the benefit of those who are coming to this who are not from Plainfield in this audience, right? His name is Alwick Brown. I want everyone to look forward to the film that he is doing on the 1967 Plainfield Rebellion, our uprising, right? And a lot of people do not appreciate the historical significance of our uprising. I want us to do that for a minute before we go any further, because we ought to, right? The Plainfield Uprising sits in the shadows of the epic Newark Rebellion because Newark was a much bigger town. And the whole country looked at Newark and Detroit more than any other town in 67. But the Plainfield Rebellion had its unique character. There was a rifle factory on the west end of town that got cleaned out by some parties unknown who made sure that our town was not going to be fired upon and made casualties in legions the way other cities had to spare that pain. And because of that dimension of our uprising, one could dare say that it was the most successful of all of the uprisings of that particular time. There were only 2 casualties in that uprising, and they were not civilian casualties, right? So in the military history of our people resisting oppression during that period, the Plainfield Rebellion, this little town in Western Union County, New Jersey, has that distinction. It's a distinction that we should absolutely appreciate. So I want to really acknowledge Ulrich, a young son, a star, an emerging filmmaker from this community for what he's trying to do. And I want to salute all those names who we'll never know, who literally saved lives, I would dare say, by virtue of having that X factor, having those arms that let the other side know that there were going to be, if there were going to be casualties in Plainfield, they were not going to be only on one side, as we saw in other cities, where most of the casualties were consequences of people being fired upon by armed forces of the state with no defense and often under any real proper pretense. So for the ancestors of the Plainfield Rebellion, the significance of the Plainfield Rebellion, I want folks to look forward to Alward Brown's film, right? Let us jump ahead. There's a clip that should have a picture of Spike Lee, a young Spike Lee, Malcolm X. It's called Zayid Spike. You can throw that up, Sophia, right? That would be right on time. Because that'll move you, not you're ahead of us. That's it right there. Now folks can see that. Now one of the things I don't want to do is just talk to a screen for about an hour and then it just be a dry talk. I want to give you as much in terms of visuals and some of Malcolm already, so this doesn't become a boring ordeal. This is one of the limitations of virtual space. If it were not in virtual space, I would be hands-on. I would be all over the stage and as close to you as I possibly can with my heart and with my soul, right? But back in 1991, there's an article by a young journalism student by the name of Todd Burrows, right, who wrote an article on the pressure that some of us put on a young filmmaker by the name of Spike Lee. And Spike was getting ready to do his film on Malcolm X. As he was doing that pressure turned out to be important because Spike at that time, even though he was doing things that got the attention of the industry, we were very concerned about the content, whether or not the content of his work would do justice to somebody as important and as sensitive as Malcolm X. So we rallied about that in Harlem. That's my comrades from the December 12th movement, Miri Baraka and some others, right? And when it came time for him to begin to get ready to open that film, we went to his space in Brooklyn and paid him a visit with demands from the community that we thought were important for him to hear and see and to consider in terms of consultation, so that he would get this right. And to his credit, he had to stop and realize that, that this undertaking was not just some run-of-the-mill money-making commercial undertaking, that he did have in his hands the life of a legend, and the people of our community were not going to let anyone just play with that legend. It was shortly after that visit that we paid him that he reached out beyond the confines of his contract with his Hollywood sponsors for some additional funding to, in his language, clean this up and get this right. And I would dare say that by virtue of the end product, after that extra effort was put into that film, that we got a film far different and far better than what he and they originally intended. And so on the national stage, that would begin my own relationship with the defending the honor of the legacy of Malcolm X. Go to the next thing I want you to throw up, if you can, Sophia, is a clip of a book by the great Alex Haley, because that will shape where I'm going to go with my remarks. While he's doing that, I want to acknowledge two people who I'm going to dedicate my remarks to. I mentioned my Uncle John Davenport, my father's baby brother. I'm going to dedicate my remarks to two native sons of Plainfield who, in the tradition of Malcolm X, as very young men, went into the Black Panther Party. Later found themselves in the Black Panther Party, came under very serious fire by the state and the Black Liberation Army, and ultimately found themselves in prison by virtue of their commitment to our people. And they both share the leadership responsibility of what is now the Jericho movement, right? And they are Ashanti Alston and Jihad Abdul Mumit. Both served over 20 years in prison by virtue of their commitment to our people's liberation, standing on the shoulders of Malcolm X. Now, this book, for my generation and the generation before me, was a big deal. It became a national hit of a television miniseries back in 1977, for those of us old enough to remember that. And television was very different then, right? We only had about 6 channels, and this was channel 7 back in those days. And so for about 5 or 6 days in a row, the screen treatment of Alex Haley's roots, of the saga of tracing an African American family's history back to its African past, gripped the nation in a way that the television industry and all of its thick racist whiteness had never dared to do before. And it was a time-marking experience. Now, Alex Haley was up underneath that. But what I want everyone to appreciate, that this was Alex Haley's response, his personal response to his relationship with Malcolm X. It was Malcolm that inspired that particular paradigm for what we got from Alex Haley then. So now let's move. Let's step ahead and move forward to Malcolm. Long after Malcolm was gone, long after Malcolm became an ancestor. Nope, not there yet. You're ahead of me, Sophia. I want you to show the clip on the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire, right? We would later learn just a few years ago that when it came to the family of Malcolm X, Malcolm's one of his most revered top titles, and he didn't live to hear this, but it was gifted to him by his friend and comrade, Ossie Davis, at his going home service back on February 27th, 1965, when he dubbed his slain friend and martyr of our human rights struggle, the Black Shining Prince, right? I don't think any of us realize the profoundness of just how real that was for that moment, and how real that turned out to be in Malcolm's own family. We would find out just a few years ago that on the little side of the family, right, on the father's side of Malcolm's family, they were able to trace their family ancestry back to Mali, right? Or the land that gave us many years ago the Malian Empire, an empire that was highly studious, was one of the most literate empires or civilizations of the world prior to the modern epic. And its most famous ruler was none other than Mansa Musa, whose Hajj was perhaps the most legendary Hajj of all of us who actually lived the life of being Muslims and performed that sacred rite, because it was Mansa Musa who had a very stellar delegation, and he literally shared the wealth of his empire. Gold was the key resource of that empire, with many of the Hajj or the pilgrimage participants in that legendary trip. It has also been said by another Jersey legend, the late great Ivan Van Sertima, that in their coming before Columbus, that there were many Africans from that empire who sojourned to what we now know as America before somebody's friend Christopher Columbus got lost and came this way. That ancestor's name was Ajar. He was a family ancestor, the African family ancestor for Malcolm X. So I wanted everybody to understand that this will be what I used to call, when I used to do regular lectures on Malcolm X, this will be through an African lens that I used to call the Omawali Talks. Omawali being Malcolm's African name that was given to him when he was in Nigeria on the first leg of that second epic trip abroad that made him most famous. Now I want you to come back to the picture of the autobiography, if you can, Sophia, right? Because now that becomes very germane to what I'm going to try and do, right? Now this book, published just after Malcolm's death, is, I would dare say, so many things that I'm going to say about Malcolm in the few minutes that we have together. I call this book a life print of African redemption. And that's what he meant it to be. Now I'm just using the contemporary expression of African-centered language to say what I mean, meaning that he used the trauma of his own personal survival and transcendence, if you will, of all of the things that he had to face as a young man that came at his family, as an example of transcendence, an example of Black resilience to having overcome some of the worst expressions of oppression. And we'll take them apart as we go along. Now that book with that very particular cover is very personal to me, because at a time in my life when I was anything but somebody that the distinguished organizers of this particular event would not at all talk to, that I was a low-level street drug dealer, and I happened to steal this book in a drug transaction back in December of 1977. And this life print then literally hit me in the face the way we were trained to hit folks in the body out of that gym that I was belonging to. And I would dare say that it saved me from, and I was on the fast track to either prison or death, saved me from going to prison, right? So, and decades later, almost 50 years later, this book, for all of its shortcomings, right? And it wasn't perfect. He wasn't able to see it through all the way through. He was assassinated before he could see the finished product. Is still saving Black lives and still showing Black men that no matter how bad things may be, or how bad the mistakes we have made in our lives, we can correct them and we can redeem ourselves in a way that can now allow us to transcend from those mistakes and make a difference. And it certainly was the case for me. So we can talk before we go to the next picture. We can certainly talk about some of those shortcomings. And I would say the shortcomings of the autobiography are twofold. One is that the writer lacked sensibility for two important dimensions of Malcolm's legacy. He didn't have any background at all with the religion that Malcolm would embrace, it is Islam, and he didn't have any background with another important dimension of Malcolm's life, and that was, having survived the streets and what telling those kinds of stories means in real time, right? For those of us who've been through those things. And the third, we just learned about within the last 10 years or so, is that there were 3 chapters that were suppressed by Mr. Haley and his publishers. And those 3 chapters will actually become the blueprint for several of Malcolm's key addresses. One chapter is called The Negro, and that will actually lay out the blueprint for what will become the classic treatise that is now known as A Message to the Grassroots. So the limitations of the autobiography, in spite of those limitations, that book is still saving lives. And you can go to the next picture because that's going to take us to another place. One of the things that I want to do with our few minutes together is to go beyond the commercially or popularly accepted framework, not that one, I should say Malcolm Ella, we'll go beyond the commercial dimensions or the contemporary dimensions of how Malcolm is saved. Malcolm is looked at as a man who went to prison, came out of prison, and was an electric speaker with the Nation of Islam, had a disagreement with his leader, went to Mecca, found the real Islam, and folks didn't understand that, and they killed him, and that was really really a shame, and that so oversimplifies and so shortchanges the incredible dimensions of Malcolm's legacy. The pic I want you to pull up, if you can, says Malcolm Ella. Right? If you can pull that up. No, well, that's right. Stay there. Before we get to Malcolm Ella, one of the things that I want folks to appreciate is that Malcolm didn't come out of the sky, and he didn't just come out of prison. And he was the son of a black woman and a black man, like all of us. And that black woman, and that's her right here there. Her name is Louise Langdon Norton Little, right? Little being her married name. And the graphic around this picture of her is of her Grenada, right? She was from the Spice Island of the Caribbean that is known as Grenada, a very small island, right? That went through all of those changes that people of African descent who were ripped from the spaces that they lived in naturally in West Africa and brought here to the West in captivity. That island went through all of those changes that you associate with our people having gone through in the Caribbean, right? What's not known and not appreciated about Malcolm's parents and about this particular black woman, and there's some new scholarship coming on up about her, and I'm doing this in an African way because in the African way, right, we trace our heritage through the line of our mothers. We are a matrilineal people, okay, right? So Malcolm's mom, Louise, right, was a serious Garveyite. She wasn't just a passing member, right, who took care of the children of the husband that is often referred to when they talk about Malcolm's family and his parents in passing. She was probably more of a lead figure within the UNIA's ranks, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. That's the UNIA. That's Garvey's organization's full name. Than she was given credit for. In 1919, the year that would give us the red hot summer of race riots and resistance in this country, right? On May 10th, 1919, she married one Earl Little in Montreal, Canada. Montreal, Canada. And I want to stop there because it's important to appreciate this about the Garvey movement. The Garvey movement was the biggest mass organizational movement of African people in the world in the modern epoch. Larger than anything since, larger than anything before that, right? And Montreal, being a gateway city in the West, was very important because it provided I'll try and use a new language, an intersectional. It was a geographical intersectional of folks coming out of this country and folks coming from the Caribbean and from Europe, right? And all those different places where they were coming from, trying to find places to work, to enter. During that period of time, you saw black folks entering the working class of the West, the international working class in a real way, and it was Garvey that organized that emergence of black folks coming out of the South in this country and out of the Caribbean into the country to participate in the industrial explosion that was also a part of the World War I era. And the men who fought in World War I came out of World War I refusing to go to the back of the bus, refusing to accept segregation. And one of the places where they found most real places to express their manhood and assert themselves was the UNIA. But it was this black woman here, Louise Langdon Norton, was one of the principal organizers for the Montreal chapter of the Garvey movement. And she was so important to the Garvey movement is that when there are times when Garvey would literally be on the run from national authorities in Canada and in the United States, that she was a part of an underground that hid Mr. Garvey at strategic times and strategic places. And it is believed that she did that both in Montreal and in Milwaukee as a part of that network of great organizers that made up the UNIA. Malcolm didn't come out of the sky, and he didn't just come out of prison. He came from that black woman and that black man, right? We go to Malcolm, and I'll come to this. That's his sister Ella. I'll come to her in a moment, right? But when he came out of prison, there's a story about him using the dictionary to revitalize his own sense of literacy. That was a routine that was given to him, then given to all of his sisters and brothers by that multilingual literate woman that was his mother, Louise Little. So I wanted folks to appreciate, the feminine heritage of this great man that often gets overlooked. Now let's come back to Ella. You just had her up. Let's come back to Ella, right? This is Malcolm's unsung legendary big sister, Ella Little Collins, right? Ella was the rescue of the family. She was Malcolm's big sister on his father's side. She was not born by Malcolm's mother, but by a previous marriage before Malcolm's father married Malcolm's mother. Ella would emerge as an independent businesswoman in Boston, Massachusetts. And as such, in her independence, she would also become a very serious player in Boston's black leadership class. And it's been said that she had a lot to do with providing black support for somebody who would later become the Speaker of the House by the name of Tip O'Neill. Now, some of us in this audience are old enough to remember when Tip O'Neill was in Congress, right? But the beginning of Tip O'Neill's ascendance had a lot to do with this black woman right here, when she led black support for him to go first into city council and then on in to Congress. And she was a real power broker for black power before we called it that in Malcolm's life and in the black community of Boston. She was a real strong, independent black woman. When Malcolm's family was torn apart, it was Ella that tried to pull those younger brothers and sisters back together, especially those that were too young to fend for themselves. And that's how Malcolm would wind up out of Michigan and into the Boston era for the first time. Now, yes, Malcolm would shift and drift to the streets in two pivotal times during that period, but it was his big sister that made sure that always had his back no matter the circumstance in his life. She would later be responsible for financing his legendary trips abroad. Malcolm went abroad 3 times. right? He went abroad in 1958 and 59. In Islam, we have a Hajj trip that is called Umrah, and that's a shortened, unofficial version of Hajj for folks who cannot go on the regular formal Hajj at its prescribed time. Malcolm did that to pave the way for his leader at the time, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who would later go um, on Hajj, even though that's not something published in the nation's history, right? But when he broke from the Nation of Islam and decided to move towards Sunni or more Orthodox Islam, right? And that trip is the most well known of his trips abroad. It was Ella who financed that trip. Malcolm did not get grants. Malcolm did not have white sponsors. None of that. Malcolm represents a totally different paradigm, a paradigm that comes out of the Black nationalist tradition, where Black organizers and Black organizations relied on their own Black dollars, right? And Ella's dollars would be key on that. She was an incredibly strong woman. She would try and hold the OAAU together, Malcolm's organization, together after he passed. And on May 19th, back in 1966, it was Ella who crafted what we now know and now perform as the annual pilgrimage and caravan to Malcolm's gravesite. And I can talk about her all day. Her home just became a national historical landmark, and she's a woman of dimensions that certainly need to be appreciated. So on the feminine side, these were the Black women who shaped who we now come to know and love as Malcolm X, his big sister Ella. Now let's move forward. Let's now begin to look at some of the places. Let's visit some of those places that we need to visit in terms of Malcolm's impact and Malcolm's legacy. Let me say that, and I'll go through this very quickly, that there were some 8 or 9 key dimensions of Malcolm's legacy. I mentioned the autobiography as a life print of African redemption or a lifeline for Black men. That's one. 2, I want us to appreciate Malcolm as a master teacher. I want you now to come forward, if you can, Sophia, with that picture of Malcolm with that quote. It says, "Malcolm, think for yourself," right? If you can come forward with that, that'll help. That's it, right? Malcolm would always say this to young people, and I'm going to say this now. It was the one thing that he wanted them to get from him, and that he would continue to want them to get from him, is to learn how to think critically for themselves. A good educational experience is supposed to do that more than anything. Allow someone to emerge from the experience with the capacity to think intelligently for themselves. And this is a picture of Malcolm listening. The great John Henry Clark taught us that Malcolm had a rare quality that few so-called leaders have, and the great ones have, and that is the capacity to listen, right? So please appreciate the loaded image that is him with that picture. And I appreciate how y'all framed that. Y'all, I just gave you the picture, the quote. Y'all prettified that with that gold and black of Frontier's colors. That's beautiful. I appreciate that. Thank you. Next, I don't know if I have that picture, but let me look. I want to show a picture of. No, it's not there. Okay. Next, I want you to appreciate that Malcolm was a master teacher. I was supposed to show you a picture of Malcolm. I was at the blackboard, the master of language, taking language apart. He was an untrained historian and an untrained linguist. He took apart the English language and really understood etymology and the science of words, right? And was master in teaching in that way. And it's one of the greatest things that you can become in the culture of our people, is to become a master teacher. Malcolm was a Jaleh. He was a griot of the highest order, right? And it was that dimension that made it very important to him going into the Nation of Islam, coming out of prison, right? An organization that had maybe about 5 to 6 or 7 small chapters of mosques at that time. But when he left, they had over 40. And he was on the ground in Black communities all over the country, from between Detroit and in the center of the country where he began, all the way east to New York and Boston and Philadelphia, on the East Coast, and all the way out to the West Coast in Los Angeles. And I'll come back to him in Los Angeles because I do have the picture. There it is. That's Malcolm the teacher, right? In a room full of black men, as a part of the manhood training that men went through in the Nation of Islam on their Wednesdays, right? Malcolm the master teacher, right? And then I want us to now I was segueing into Malcolm not just being a master teacher, but that was one of the dimensions of Malcolm being what he does not get credit for. And that was as being one of the best organizers that we had. He was a quintessential organizer, right? And it was this organizing energy and fire that he brought to the Nation of Islam that was responsible for its catalytic growth between 1952 and when he left in 1963. 5 to 7 mosques that were on the small side when he came in, over 40, and some with very robust memberships when he left in 1963, 1964. Malcolm, the organizer, right? The next, I want us to also appreciate that Malcolm, and one of his accomplishments is that he made the question of being armed, question of having capacity to defend ourselves and to fight for ourselves with arms, right? He legitimized that question with a moral urgency like no one else at his time. During his time, the popular notion of protest was limited to First Amendment notions of modest marching and rallies, maybe some boycotting and whatnot, and absolutely being totally committed to nonviolence, right? While we still lived under the threat of the most horrific expressions of violence that we have lived under since the end of slavery, everything from police brutality to the scourge of lynching. Malcolm would dare say during that period that any people having to face that has the right to defend themselves. So the question of are people having an armed tradition to make a difference in our lives was a consequence of his contribution to that particular movement, right? Malcolm also championed what was known as Black nationalism and Black power, right? And I want us to appreciate in this particular moment go back, you go back, you're ahead of me, Sophia. Go back to the picture with Kwame Ture. Right? This is Kwame Ture, a young Stokely Carmichael in the Deep South in Lowndes County, Alabama, right? And this is important because Kwame had then become the chairperson of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the student or the youth wing of the Civil Rights Movement. And I would dare say that wing of the Civil Rights Movement was the most militant, ultimately the most revolutionary, right? And the most challenging to the paradigm that the Civil Rights Movement was placed in, right? Kwame, picking up on Malcolm's contributions to Black nationalism and Black power, right, created something through SNCC called the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. It was a challenge to the Democratic Party, which was then very Dixiecratic, very much a Dixiecrat party in the South. It would not allow Black folks to vote, right? But in the challenge for voter registration and the challenge for the ballot, this was an armed formation that broke from the two-party system as we now know it, right? The Lowndes County Freedom Organization was a departure, an independent departure from the two-party construct, and that led to the first wave of Black folks voting in Lowndes County, Alabama, in the state of Alabama, and ultimately, the beginning of Black leadership in places in Alabama where our numbers were such that allowed us to catapult to leadership, right? And its symbol, you see the Sentinel and that big poster, its symbol was the panther, the Black Panther, right? the origins of the Black Panther Party, you can move to the next one now, Sophia, right? Were in the South. And the battle for the ballot was not won by nonviolence alone. And I want everybody to appreciate, not that one, the picture of the Panther, right? There you go, right? This is the cover of the Black Panther Party, where the Black Panther Party dares to say that they are the heirs of Malcolm X. And in many obvious ways, they definitely were, right? But its origins lie in the South in the battle for the ballot. And the battle for the ballot being in part an armed battle, that is a consequence of Malcolm asserting in a morally compelling way our people's right to do that, right? So Black power means a lot of things, but they're one of those I want everybody to appreciate that in the throes of struggle, that was one of the material ways in which it definitely manifested itself. Now, let's go. We can go further a little slowly. You can go to the next one, right? When Malcolm is assassinated, the Kwame Ture. No, go back to the Kwanzaa picture, right? When Malcolm was assassinated, right? Kwame said Malcolm's blood fertilized the transformation of the movement, right? Malcolm is assassinated in the middle of the 1960s, right? And so with his emergence, with his death, right, and young people taking his death so deeply personal, right, there was a new explosion of diverse protests in the nationalist tradition, right, that made Black power real in a range of ways. Now, the Black Panther Party is the most well known of all of those, but this is you can't. I don't know if you can make out who's in the middle of that picture, but that's a picture of she's an elder now, but that's Camille Yarborough, and Camille Yarborough was an important expression of the cultural explosion that our people went through in the aftermath of Malcolm's death. Malcolm called for the liberation of the African personality or cultural revolution. It's one of the things that he called for with his founding of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and people took that serious. People like Maulana Karinga, and you see the 7 principles. You see that Kwanzaa Kanara, right? That is one of the fruits of Malcolm's call for the liberation of the African personality or for cultural revolution, right? In New Jersey, it would take on a very special meaning. We can go to the next slide, right? The next slide should be Amiri Baraka, right? Amiri Baraka in Newark, New Jersey, gave us the Committee for a Unified Newark, and on the national stage gave us the Congress of African Peoples. And their motto was that Malcolm represented the trinity of Black power: self-determination, self-respect, and self-defense, right? And that particular organization and the organizations related to the Congress of African People, right, brought the whole question of Black power, pushing for the ballot and doing it sometimes where necessary with arms. That happened in Newark, New Jersey, right? Newark, New Jersey was an urban gangster apartheid city in the north, run by gangsters who had extra legal armed forces in the streets on top of a brutal police force that kept Newark one of this country's most segregated northern cities. Baraka, Amiri Baraka, the Imamu, the leader, picked up the question of culture and picked up the question of armed self-defense and picked up the question of fighting for the ballot by any means necessary in Newark, organized the challenge that ended urban apartheid here in New Jersey and had people coming to Newark to become a part of our movement in ways that blow a lot of our minds, right? This is a picture later on during that same period, several years later, and we're close to the 50th anniversary of the Gary Convention. See, Malcolm also, in his call for Black power and Black nationalism, always advocated the notion of the united front, right? He was a legendary coalition builder when he was in the Nation of Islam. He was a legendary coalition builder when he left the Nation of Islam, seeking to develop the Organization of Afro-American Unity, because in his call ultimately to internationalize and revolutionize our struggle it was absolutely necessary to have that kind of unity going into the international community, right? As other countries were breaking the yokes of colonialism, right, on the verge of their becoming stewards of their own independent destinies, they had to forge united fronts or national liberation fronts to assert their legitimacy on the one hand, and to actually forge the unity necessary to be recognized by the international community on the other hand, right? Gary represented an effort to try and do that for our people in a post-Malcolm period. This is in 1972, where Black folks came from all over to Gary, Indiana, right? Whose mayor was Richard Hatcher, a very progressive Black mayor whose legacy needs to be revisited. Also, I would dare say, for young folks looking to run for office, right? And when there was a rupture in that convention, when certain forces sought to walk out of the convention thinking that they deserved more authority in that convention, it was Amiri who rescued the convention and brought everybody together. Next year, the city of Newark, under the leadership of his son, Mayor Ras Baraka, will host the 50th anniversary of the Gary Convention. And it is a place to go for that generation of new organizers that gave us the hot summer of protests. The hot summer of protests that was the summer of 2020, on the heels of the killing in spectacle fashion of George Floyd on May 25th, which happens also to be African Liberation Day. A place where those forces can come together and talk once again about the necessary of forging that kind of united front for this particular time, for the needs of this particular moment. So I wanted to do that. Now I'm going to stop for a second. There are more I'm going to add to that, but I want to stop for a second. And Sophia, if you can pull up, well, actually you did it already. The video that you opened up with, and I don't know, I think there might have been some sound with it, right? But the video that you opened up with was Malcolm in Los Angeles talking about police brutality. But I want you to come and do the video clip, if you will, of Philanois Floyd. Philanois Floyd is George's brother. Run that clip if you can. And he's doing the Malcolm one. If it works, go ahead and do it. This particular speech of Malcolm has been getting a lot of love in recent months, and I'll tell why when it's a. Can y'all hear that? It's just a short clip. I don't know if we can hear it. I don't know if they were able to hear that. See if you can do the one with George Floyd's brother. We're still trying to do that.
Element.
There you go. You got sound. There you go.
The police are able to use the press to make the white public think that 90% or 99% of the Negroes in the Negro community are criminals. And once the white public is convinced that most of the Negro community is a criminal element, then this automatically paves the way for the police to move into the Negro community, exercising Gestapo tactics, stopping any black man who is on the sidewalk, whether he is guilty or whether he is innocent, whether he is well-dressed or whether he is poorly dressed, whether he is educated or whether he is dumb, whether he's a Christian or whether he's a Muslim. As long as he is black and a member of the Negro community, the white public thinks that the white policeman is justified in going in there and trampling on that man's civil rights and on that man's human rights.
Yeah, good, good. Now, what are we dealing with now? Some 50 some odd years later. This was done in 1962. Malcolm has two legendary confrontations with the issue of police brutality in his life. And I want to talk about those just for a moment. 1957 is one of the things that Spike got right in his film that helped that film stand the test of time, I would dare say, consequently, was the attack on a nation foot soldier in Mosque Number 7 under Malcolm's command by the name of Hinton Johnson. Hinton was savagely beaten because Hinton would not stand by idly and watch the police beat somebody else up unjustly and cruelly, and was himself attacked and had his skull split and the whole nine. And it was captured well in that particular flick. And Malcolm challenged the New York City police in a very unique NOI, way. And it was an epic moment. And it really began the development of the emergence of the legend of Malcolm X. Malcolm stood up to police brutality in a stoic, bold, courageous way.
Hi, my name is Honest Floyd, and I'm
folks that folks had not heard or seen before. I'm hearing something else in the background. All right, we're okay. So that was important. What you just looked at was Malcolm in Los Angeles. Los Angeles mosque number 27. Malcolm helped start that mosque, and it was one of the first mosques, left of the Midwest that blew up on its own. And that mosque, the treasurer, that mosque faced an attack in April of 1962 that left about 7 or 8 Muslims who were shot down in the front of their mosque because they were not going to let the police just run up in their mosque. And one was killed, and he was the treasurer of the mosque. His name was Ronald Stokes, and he was a very loved brother in his mosque, a very loved brother in his family, in his community, and to the national community of the Nation of Islam. And Malcolm took that very personal. And when you see, that speech, right, that is Malcolm doing coalition building in Los Angeles, forging a local united front around the question of police brutality, right? The Los Angeles Police Department was legendary for its brutality in the Black community back then, right? And no one stood up to it the way Malcolm did then. And to be sure, Malcolm wanted to do more with the underground capacity of the FOI to address that if need be in the wake of the loss of Ronald Stokes. And his leader disagreed with that and actually pulled him out of Los Angeles because he was concerned that Malcolm may go a little further than he was ready to have the troops of the NOI go at that particular moment. And I would dare say that was the real beginning of the end of his relationship with the Nation of Islam. But when you see that speech, that's the background. It was May 5th, 1962. Malcolm is telling the story of what happened to the men to the community, and bringing the organizations from the NAACPs and all the other grassroots community organizations that were concerned about the scourge of police brutality in their community. That's Malcolm, the coalition builder. It didn't just happen after he left the Nation of Islam. It happened very much when he was in the Nation of Islam, everywhere he went, when he was really trying to build for the nation's contribution, or his vision of a nation contributing to what we now call Black Power. That's important. Now, you found the George Floyd piece. Go ahead and run that.
Hi, my name is Philonus Floyd, and I'm the brother of George Floyd. On May 25th, 2020, my brother was tortured and murdered by 4 police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the United States. I thank you for holding this urgent meeting for the opportunity to speak to you today. My brother was unarmed and was accused of passing a counterfeit $20 bill. The entire incident showed my brother murdered was captured on camera. My family and I had to watch the last moments of his life when he was tortured to death, including the 8 minutes and 46 seconds one officer kept his knee on my brother's neck. My brother begged the officer for his life, cried out for our mama, who was already dead, and said over and over again, "I can't breathe." Even after my brother was unconscious, stopped moving, and stopped breathing, the officers kept his knee on my brother's neck for another 4 minutes, as many witnesses begged the officer to take his knee off my brother's neck and save his life. The officer showed no mercy, no humanity, and tortured my brother to death in the middle of the street in Minneapolis, and with the crowd of witnesses watched and begging them to stop showing us Black people the same lesson yet again. Black lives do not matter in the United States of America. None of the police officers were fired for murdering my brother until masses of people in the United States and around the world protested the injustice. When people dared to raise their voice and protest for my brother, they were tear gassed, run over with police vehicles. Several people lost eyes and suffered brain damage to rubber bullets. Peaceful protesters were shot and killed by police. Journalists were beaten and blinded when they tried to show the world the brutality happening at the protests. When people raise their voices to protest the treatment of Black people in America, they are silenced, they are shot and killed. My brother George Floyd is one of the many Black men and women that have been murdered by police in recent years. The sad truth is that the case is not unique. The way you saw my brother tortured and murdered on camera is the way Black people are treated by police in America. You watched my brother die. That could have been me. I am my brother's keeper. You in the United Nations are your brothers and sisters keepers in America, and you have the power to help us get justice for my brother George Floyd. I'm asking you to help him. I'm asking you to help me. I'm asking you to help us, Black people in America. I hope that you would consider establishing an independent commission of inquiry to investigate police killings of Black people in America and the violence used against peaceful protesters.
Now I want to stop right there for a minute. Revisiting Malcolm X, in the language of hip hop, booyah. Here we are. That was Illinois' Floyd, George Floyd's brother, addressing the United Nations Human Rights Council. And he wasn't just talking about George. He was talking about what was happening to protesters taken to the streets all over, not just in this country, but all over the Western Hemisphere, right? One of the things that Malcolm tried to do with in his coalition building and in his trying to revitalize notions of how we see and define ourselves, self-determination. His notion of Afro-American is very different from what you call African-American. What we call African-American refers to folks in the United States of African descent, right? Who survivors of the slave experience here in the United States. Malcolm's notion of Afro-American was hemispheric. Any person of African descent born in the Western Hemisphere was Afro-American. That was his definition, right? And they all need to be organized as a united force, for our human rights in the international stage and the quest for broader independent expression and power, right? That was his notion. So when protests blew up around police brutality in this country, they blew up from Boston to Buenos Aires, from London to Los Angeles. Black folks all over the place turned it up. Why? Because they were facing similar experiences in those places where they were, right? And that whole notion came together like we have not seen ever again. And it is the moral, historical imperative of this particular moment of us, the challenge of this particular time, for us to find the way to forge those proper coalitions in the name of the notion that Malcolm tried to use when he really moved into the international stage, time is now to make Pan-Africanism real, right? And the question of international human solidarity real, like we haven't had an opportunity to do that since his time. And let's go one step further. Today is May 15th. It's the anniversary of what we know in the international community as Nakba, right? Or the mass suffering of a traumatic mass ethnic cleansing launching that took place in what we now know as Israel, right? From May 15th, 1948 to several weeks later, some 700,000 people were displaced from their homeland in what was then Palestine in the name of creating this settler colonial state that is now known as Israel. At the end of Ramadan, and belated Eid Mubarak to any Muslims who participated in the Ramadan fast this particular year, the night of power, the most sacred night of Ramadan, and one of the most sacred spaces in the world of Islam, that was the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, came under attack by Israeli police forces in a way that speaks to no one's human rights whatsoever. And Palestinians are under attack like they have not seen in quite some time. So Nakba emerges, right, under the clouds of blood that demands from all of us who are concerned about human rights, that demands solidarity from us, the way that Malcolm certainly tried to give and call for solidarity with the Palestinian people back at a time when very few folks would do that. So I have to share that. So the international dimensions of Malcolm's legacy, right, on a human rights premise, right, are as present now as he tried to make them present back in 1964 and 1965. I'm tempted. Let me just look and see what I have left for you. I'm almost tempted to stop there, but I'm not. I'm going to add two other pieces, and then I'll wrap up and let us go to question and answers. Let's go to this clip that says Malcolm X in Selma. I want you to hear Malcolm one more time before we wind up this portion of our talk. Malcolm in Selma. If you can.
And now, if the federal government.
You were there.
And now, if the federal government.
Oh, we're struggling with that. That's a shame.
Does not find it within its power and ability.
There you go.
To investigate a criminal organization such as the Klan, then you and I are within our right to wire Secretary General Usar of the United Nations and charge the federal government in this country behind.
Come on, Clip. Come on, Clip.
Johnson was being derelict in its duty to protect the human rights of 22 million black people in this country, and in their failure to protect our human rights, they are violating the United Nations Charter, and they are not qualified to continue to sit in that international body and talk about what human rights should be done in other countries on this earth. I have to say this, and I'll sit down. Back during slavery, when black people like me talk to the slaves, they didn't kill him. They sent some old house Negro along behind him to undo what he said. You have to read the history of slavery to understand this. There were two kinds of Negroes. There was that old house Negro and the field Negro. And the house Negro always looked out for his master. When the field Negroes got too much out of line, he held them back in check. He put them back on the plantation. The house Negro could afford to do that because he lived better than the field Negro. He ate better, he dressed better, and he lived in a better house. He lived right up next to his master in the attic or the basement. He ate the same food his master ate and wore his same clothes. And he could talk just like his master. Good diction. And he loved his master more than his master loved himself. That's why he didn't want his master hurt. If the master got sick, he'd say, "What's the matter, boss? We sick?" He was as sick as the master. When the master's house caught a fire, he'd try and put the fire out. He didn't want his master's house burned. He never wanted his master's property threatened. And he was more defensive of it than the master was. That was the house Negro. But then you had some field Negroes who lived in huts. Had nothing to lose. They wore the worst kind of clothes. They ate the worst food. And they caught hell. They felt the sting of the lash. They hated their master. Oh, yes, they did. If the master got sick, they prayed that the master died.
Did we lose it?
If the master's house caught a fire, they prayed for a strong wind to come along. This was the difference between the two. And today you still have house Negroes and field Negroes. I'm a field Negro. If I can't live in the house as a human being, I'm praying for a wind to come along. If the master won't treat me right and he's sick, I'll tell the doctor to go in the other direction. But if all of us are going to live as human beings, as brothers, then I'm for a society of human beings that can practice brotherhood. So before I sit down, I want to thank you for listening to me. I hope I haven't put anybody on the spot. I'm not intending to try and stir you up and make you do something that you wouldn't have done anyway. I pray that God will bless you in everything that you do. I pray that you will grow intellectually so that you can understand the problems of the world and where you fit into in that world picture. And I pray that all the fear that has ever been in your heart will be taken out. And when you look at that man, if you know he's nothing but a coward, you won't fear him. If he wasn't a coward, he wouldn't gang up on you. He wouldn't need to sneak around here. This is how they function. They function in mobs. That's a coward. They put on a sheet so you won't know who they are. That's a coward. No. The time will come when that sheet will be ripped off. If the federal government doesn't take it off, we'll take it off.
We can wrap up with two other clips. There's a picture of Khalid Abdul Muhammad in Jasper, Texas, confronting the Ku Klux Klan. Put that picture up. That's very important because we're going to revisit Malcolm for real in May. All right.
Hi, my name is.
The pic says Khalid Jasper. Just as Malcolm made a question of armed self-defense a morally compelling one for his period, it has relevance in this period also. I don't know if you can find that, right? But those of you who know me know that I ran the New Black Panther Party, an armed organization for better than 10 years in this part of the country, right? And one of its moments in the sun was when Khalid Abdul Muhammad challenged the Ku Klux Klan by force of arms in Jasper, Texas, in the wake of the lynching of a man in Jasper, Texas back in the 1990s, right? Right? That's in our lifetime. That's my generation, right? And the only one that's not armed in that picture was the leader. His name is Khalid Abdul Muhammad. So I need folks to appreciate that. Now let's go to one last clip. Can you find it? It was that one last clip. That one. I want everybody to appreciate it. You can find the last clip that says self-destruction.
We all agree tonight, all of the speakers have agreed that America has a very serious problem. Not only does America have a very serious problem, but our people have a very serious problem. America's problem is self-destruction. Yeah, for self-destruction. Self-destruction. Yeah, for self-destruction. Self-destruction. Yeah, for self-destruction. Self-destruction. Well, today's topic, self-destruction, it really ain't the rap audience is bugging. It's one or two suckers, ignorant brothers, trying to rob and steal from one another. You get caught in the
mid. So to crush that stereotype, here's what we did. We got ourselves together so that you can unite and fight for what's right. Not negative cause. The way we live is positive. We don't kill our relatives.
Pop, 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 when it's shot, who's to blame? Headline, front page, and raps the name. MC Delight here to state the bottom line. The black on black crime was way before our time.
Took a brother's life with a knife, that's his wife. Cried cause he died of trifling death when he left his very last breath. Was I slept, so watch your step. Back in the 60s, our brothers and sisters were hanged. How could you gang bang? I never ever ran from the Ku Klux Klan.
We don't have to do the whole thing. The whole thing is 6 minutes. So revisiting Malcolm, this is the way the so-called hip-hop generation has tried to revisit Malcolm. Out of all of our freedom fighters who were sampled, Malcolm is the most sampled. And out of all of his speeches that are sampled, the message to the grassroots is the most sampled. And it's hard to believe that that clip, that song put together, that production of the Stars of Hip Hop of the 1990s, that was back in 1990. That was 30 years ago, right? Hip hop has done finally grown up, right? And we need another coming together in hip hop to address the question of violence in our community, right? And that's something that Malcolm, very important to Malcolm's legacy. And I'll end with this footnote, right? There were three important assassinations in our people's struggle of the 1960s that were done in a certain way to prevent certain kinds of coming togethers from happening and to set off the violence that we see in the African world in a range of places. At the top of the decade, the killing of Patrice Lumumba, right? Sitting on the most rich land on the face of the earth that was in South Central Africa that we now know that has been known to the world as the Congo, right? Done with black hands to try and cover broader northern culpability, right? And would ultimately set off a black on black equation of that we would see on the African continent that predates the black on black violence that we see in our community. Malcolm, the quintessential organizer for Black Power, right? Who had a way of speaking to black men on the streets and coming out of the throes of prison, right? Offering them a different way to walk as black men, as an alternative to the dead-end street that was the streets in the prison. And at the end of the decade, right? And it was just a big deal about this in movie land, right? Fred Hampton, assassinated led by a black police officer named Gloves Davis and set up by a black informant named William O'Neill, right? Legendary for turning bangers into revolutionaries, right? The Young Lord Party was a Young Lord gang, street organization that became a revolutionary organization following Fred Hampton's lead and example, right? Fred was talking to the big street organizations in Chicago, and Chicago is much bigger than any city that we've got in New Jersey, folks, right? And they have a serious black on black crime problem that is worse than what we have here, however bad we have it in certain places in New Jersey. And I'm talking about Newark, and I'm talking about Camden and the Plainfields amongst us, right? Fred had those brothers talking to each other and looking at each other very differently, and the government was worried about them going from that kind of organizing into this kind of organizing, meaning the kind of organizing that represented the alternative that was the Black Panther Party. And he was taken from us at 21 years old at the end of that epic decade, right? So I want people to appreciate the price that these men paid and how Malcolm was at the center of all of that for our people's consciousness in trying to do that. And that may be telling us that the time has come for us to move away from personality-centered leadership. Personality-centered leadership, and to move towards group leadership so that we're no longer isolated the way our leaders were isolated back then. I'll stop there and we can go into our conversation and our questions and answers.
Well, Zayid, first of all, thank you very much for taking us on that journey as we revisit the life and legacy of Malcolm X. Certainly a timely message and a lesson and lecture for all of us to either ascend to in an attempt in our lives or to really extract from so that we can learn how to better contend with what we face even today. Now, there have been some questions that have been posted and some comments, and I want to give you an opportunity to respond to those in your own words, as in any manner that you choose to do. But I want to begin first with Principal Kafele. He said, Brother Zayid, when you can. Yes, exactly.
A master teacher, everybody. A national legend who does not get the props he deserves right here in Jersey. I'm going to make it plain. We need to be building around the Baruti Kafeles amongst us in those communities where we are control of the boards of education. Go ahead. What did Kafele say? I definitely want to hear.
I think you hit the button right on the nose. You hit it with the nail right on the head, because even with our control of local boards of education, right, New Jersey in itself still contends with truly implementing even the Amistad Act. But I mean,
Right on.
those are some challenges that exist. But Principal Kafele said this. He said, Zayid, when you can you give us your thoughts on Les Payne's book on Malcolm, The Dead Are Arising? What are some of your thoughts about that book?
I have a lot of thoughts on that book. First, let me say that Les Payne, I love that brother, right? His daughter, Tamara Payne, was a founding member of the Malcolm X Commemoration Committee with me, right? And I've been trying to get hold of her so I could do something with her, right? And I have been able to get her to do that. The book has done very well. I'm glad the book is done. She literally rescued what she had of his papers to pull that together. Les passed away before he could finish the book. So if there are any shortcomings, it's because Mr. Payne was called to the land of ancestors before he could personally finish it. And so it's not a perfect book, but it's a very good book. It's a very important contribution. I would hope it's a book that helps us forget the mess that Manning Marable made, and I'm going to be very plain about that, right? Manning Marable had at his disposal the capacity to give us something far different and with far more substance than he did. But that venture turned into a commercial venture. And so this democratic socialist found himself in a commercial lane, willing to be used to try and take down Malcolm by attacking Malcolm's family legacy and his written legacy, that is the autobiography. That is not what we're getting from Les Payne in The Dead Are Rising. We get some pictures of Malcolm's early life that are important, right? We get a very chilling picture of where that assassination, how that assassination was orchestrated at the very end. There are a couple of holes in it that I kind of wish we were around. I think we could have filled that we wanted to correct. But for the most part, it's a very good book. Les Payne, I went into journal. Les Payne is one of the reasons why I trained to be a journalist, right? Les Payne, Tony Brown, Gil Noble. And let me add to that, because there's certain places I want people to go to look at, to study Malcolm, because see, there's a lot of commercial activity around Malcolm right now. I wanted to do the Selma clip because the first breakout of commercial activity around Malcolm is in the film Selma. There's a weak portrayal of Malcolm in the film Selma, right? That does in no way comports to what really happened in Malcolm's relationship to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the relationship he was trying to put together in support of Martin Luther King, who was in custody at the time down in Selma. He came down there to support him, and the dialogue between him and Coretta, and there's some beautiful pictures of that need to be appreciated too, are the real, we spoke to the real depth of that particular moment. So books. I'm talking about Manning Marable critically. The person that should have gotten that gig was William Sales. William Sales was a warrior scholar who was actively involved in our struggle. He was in the student movement. He was a student at Columbia, right? Where Malcolm's papers were housed. This is what Manning Marable had to work with, right? and Bill Sales, student of Columbia, alumni of Columbia, who gave us Malcolm X Speaks in the 90s conferences back in the early 1990s that brought scholars and activists together from all over the world. Even Cuba hosted their own version of that particular thing because of their own relationship and appreciation of Malcolm as a beacon of international human solidarity, who they love, right? Bill Sales should have gotten that gig. But Bill, in his own right, also gave us a very important book called From Civil Rights to Black Liberation, Malcolm X and the OAAU, that should be in everybody's bookshelf, right? I was mad at my folks when Who Killed Malcolm X, but that was a commercial venture for Netflix. That wasn't a 501c3 grassroots humanitarian documentary. It was a commercial venture, right? So they cut that in a way that just wasn't correct as far as I was concerned. And you saw me in this presentation talk about the importance of Amiri Baraka in Newark, and that's the real legacy of Malcolm in Newark, not just the knuckleheads who actually pulled the trigger and took Malcolm out of here, but what our movement did, picking up Malcolm's legacy to move it forward, right? I even brought them to the young man, and he was a high school student at the time, Akili Buchanan, who's a member of the People's Organization for Progress, a teacher at Weequahic High School. But as a high school student, Akili Buchanan led the charge to have Southside High School renamed Malcolm X Shabazz High School in the context of Amiri Baraka setting Newark on fire and getting the attention of the world for our people around Malcolm's line like no other time in our history. They got that all wrong, right? And that's what I was trying to get. They cut that part out. And even when they had Achilles, they just threw the picture up of I can't call his name. He just died, but who was outed to be the shotgunner. They threw that at Achilles. Achilles was a teenager. He didn't know anything about it. None of us knew anything about that at that point of his life. Achilles, as a young organizer, right? Because Malcolm inspired young people like no other. As a young organizer, led the charge to it was the first institution in this country to be named after Malcolm X, right? And as one of the things that's important about self-determination that we learned from Amiri coming out of Malcolm's line is that wherever we're majority too, when it comes to our institutions, we have the right to claim them with our own ancestors who were responsible for the start of those institutions, or other ancestors whose contributions were legendary in their own right and deserve their names on these schools, just like back in the day when you got Lincoln's high schools and Columbus schools, and but they got their heroes, we got ours. Yeah. Self-determination, we can do that. So I wanted to just shout that out. So the book is good. The book is good. The book is an important contribution, right? It's not perfect, but less. We lost less. So I appreciate the heroism of Tamara trying to resurrect her father's work.
Indeed, absolutely, and it's to be commended and celebrated. I do want to take this opportunity really quickly to briefly preface this next question and comment. It's coming from a viewer by the name of Sheila Montague. And it's centered around, and you just mentioned the documentary that Netflix produced, and you appeared in the documentary, and in her comment, she mentions that during the documentary and when folks were trying to investigate Malcolm X's assassination, that you reportedly replied with a quote of "Leave it alone." I think that in all fairness to you and in the opportunity afforded to us now with this space and time, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
I wish we could run the clip, because you should run it. If we could run the clip, that's not all I said.
Okay.
Now let's talk about that. We should talk about that. And the thing I said is that leave that alone, meaning that, and this is the brother, his name was Abdul Rahman Muhammad. He had come up for the pilgrimage. And he did that. He was just trying to stage something really quick the way he asked it. I also said, leave that alone, because if you be careful where you go with that, because that man, if he did what he did, he is being protected by the state, right? So if you run the clip, that's what I said, right? Folks stopped at me saying, leave that alone. But that's not all I said. I contextualized that. And I'll say it again. If that man did what he did, and it looks like he did, and he was open in the community like that for as long as he has been, it is only because somebody was protecting him. And I'll go further than that, because the other thing that they took out of the flick is this. I'm gonna make this plain. I ran an armed organization. And when that came out about, his name is Bradley, right?
Bradley.
About Bradley being the shotgunner, I had people from the underground and people above ground wanted me to sanction a hit on Bradley. You hear what I'm saying to you? I'm making it plain, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I had to do, right? Malcolm did not want the beef that he was in with the Nation of Islam to turn into a full shooting war or bloodbath. He did not want that to happen. He knew this thing could end, could and would probably end his life, but he did not want the violence to continue. He wanted it to, if there was going to be any violence, he wanted it to be and end with him, not with his family, not with his children, not with any of the brothers that were committed to him. He didn't want any of that. And then you see how I ended this. I ended this with the whole question of us having to confront the question of violence in our community. Now, even though I had the military capacity to have that man killed, I told those brothers above ground and below ground, leave that man alone. Said that, I would probably be in prison now, and I'm sure they would. Because if he was protected the way I believe he was under constant surveillance, and I know I'm under constant surveillance, I would be in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. And quite frankly, that bastard wasn't worth it. I don't want any more political prisoners on my watch. I have got people who have been in prison more than 50 years.
Wow.
And folks who want to, come out with this kind of nonsense and this kind of question won't raise a finger to uplift some of the people who committed their lives to our struggle, picking up Malcolm's line the way few of us wouldn't dare to do. So go back to the videotape and look at the whole thing and get it right.
Well, I think it's important. I think it's important because, as you referenced, context matters.
Yes, it does.
And so, providing the feedback that you've done, I wanted to make sure you had that opportunity because it's shared not only in the broadcast, but also in the comments that we're seeing here. So I'm glad that you were able to respond, and that
I'm glad you lifted it up because that's important.
You're pulling up that. I was searching for the clip as you were speaking, and I couldn't find one that was short enough.
It's still in Netflix land. It's there. The folks go back to it. I believe that's the 5th or 6th episodes where that takes place, right? So just the folks can go back and look at it for themselves.
Indeed. And one comment from a brother, Ibrahim Muhammad, he just mentioned that regarding such an investigation, I think he says something that's very, very instrumental. It's very telling of the state of our union, the state of our country, and the state of our society. And he says, and I quote, "They can't investigate unless they start at the White House."
Yeah, he's absolutely right. An investigation like that. Let's come back to Felonious Floyd, George's brother, right?
Yeah.
What did he ask for? He asked for an international inquiry, an international investigation on the question of police violence in the United States against African descendants, right? The international community has made this the International Decade for People of African Descent. This is year 6 of that decade, right? And underneath that call for that recognition is the broader call for reparations.
Yes.
Reparations. And reparations is important because reparations is not just about compensating our people for what happened to us and our ancestors. It's about repairing the damage of the impact of the racism that we all have faced and all have had to endure and all will continue to do if no structural change takes place under the system that we live under, right?
And even with reparations, there comes this need, this requirement that we be honest about the state of society today. Because even though attempts can be made to repair those harms, those repairs have to be done in a manner that they recognize that the harms are still being perpetuated today, and they will likely continue to be perpetuated moving forward. So there have to be repairs that are structural, that are systemic, that are innovative and forward thinking, so that they continue to grow and to address those harms as they go beyond today.
The
So,
first step in restorative justice is acknowledgement of the wrong.
absolutely.
The
Absolutely.
second step is to do what is required so that the wrong is meaningfully addressed and structurally is not allowed to happen again. You are dead on point. And that young man in that comment is correct, right?
Yeah.
Malcolm's assassination was an international collaboration, and it was set in motion. The late great John Henry Clark, and I want everybody to get Dr. Clark's book Malcolm X, The Man in His Times. It's an anthology that he put together dedicated to Malcolm shortly after Malcolm's death, that includes when Malcolm was approached by the FBI back in February 1964, the third of three times, to become a paid informant for the FBI, and Malcolm, in a very ministerial way, told him to go to hell. No, and I'm saying that to raise one of the things that we cannot lose sight of in our honoring Malcolm X is the stellar dimensions of his character. Right? Looking at this through an African lens, right? And he followed the traditional African value system, right? The word is iwapele, right? Upstanding character. Malcolm was stellar, uncorruptible, disciplined, principled in everything he did. Once he embraced the principles that made the difference, or made him the difference maker in all of our lives. He was totally sincere. He was somebody that was not going to be bought, paid off, reduced to a commercial, soundbite, none of that. Malcolm would have none of that. And that's why he's not here.
Indeed. And I want to take this moment because we are approaching the top of the hour. I would like to highlight one final question for your response. And this comes by way of your fellow John Brinkley. And he mentioned that Malcolm.
John, thank you too for setting this off. I really appreciate you, John, right?
Indeed. Yeah, we lean heavily on John because he does such a good job with our community engagement and working alongside our partners to make sure these types of events continue to take place. But he says Malcolm formed the OAAU, taking more of a Pan-African view. How effective do you feel he was in moving the African Americans to have a more Pan-African perspective, and how does that look today?
He didn't have time, unfortunately. There's a reason. So they didn't just kill Malcolm because he was in the way of something or because he was starting something that was dangerous. They killed him because they did not want him to get any momentum with his organizing charge, right? The question of Pan-Africanism is as relevant now as it ever was. There are Pan-African dimensions to what's happening now. I believe that that's the challenge of this historical moment, is to raise the question of Pan-Africanism the way we haven't raised it since Malcolm made that call, right? And the call goes back to the Garvey era, right? Garvey was petitioning the then League of Nations under a Pan-African paradigm, right? Du Bois was ejected from the NAACP for making a similar call to the beginning of the early days of the United Nations. Paul Robeson actually had a petition presented to the United Nations, him and William Patterson, back in 1951, and that was in response to there was then a Soviet bloc. There was a bloc of nations that were willing to support that out of Western Europe that were more aligned with the Soviet Union. But Malcolm came along at a time where Malcolm came along during the non-aligned movement era, right? The anti-colonial era, where a number of nations in Africa, Latin America, and in Asia were becoming independent and did not want to be dependent in any way on neither the Soviet Union or the United States at that particular time. And they represented a third force in international politics, and that's what Malcolm was trying to link us up with in a Pan-African lens. Now, there's a phenomenon that we have to deal with that makes it difficult for this particular time that we need to appreciate too. Malcolm got a lot of mileage in Ghana. There was a Ghana chapter of the OAU. Maya Angelou, Alice Wyndham, and several others formed that chapter of the OAAU. Maya was on her way back to the United States to help Malcolm organize the OAAU in the United States when he was killed. Okay, so he really didn't get a chance to get out of the block the way he wanted to, right? And they were very strategic in the timing of his assassination to prevent that from happening. But the book is still out. I believe, I have full faith in my daughters and granddaughters and sons and grandsons who gave us that hot summer, that they pick up this mantle, that they study Malcolm, that they study, all those previous expressions of protest that brought them to this historical moment, and figure out how to reconfigure that for this particular time, to move that forward. And there's some things that I'm looking at that I'm very proud of, that I see. I'm very proud of the movement for Black Lives, for example, a coalition of organizations different from Black Lives Matter, which is more disparate, right? But movement for Black Lives is a genuine coming together of a national coalition of social justice organizations in the Black community that have that kind of potential, and there are others, right? The other thing I want you to appreciate about Malcolm in this particular moment, directly related to Pan-Africanism, right? I would dare say, is the question of the feminine principle, right? Most of the protest activity that you see of our young people now, it's not surprising to me that you see it being led by young Black women, right? Malcolm was one of the first of his time to speak out on the question of sexism in our movement, sexism in our community, the sexism as a construct that needs to be deconstructed, just like racism needs to be deconstructed, right? So as a matrilineal people, when our daughters and our mothers come forward, they need to be supported and protected to the umpteenth, right? And they are more than likely willing to put together paradigms where people can force change and at the same time transform and heal themselves from the pain of what we've been through. And that's the richness and the depth of the feminine principle. So I want us to recognize that's right in our hands right now. So the book is still out on that question.
Well, Brother Zayid, I am so grateful that you decided to join us on today. I thank you for your time and your efforts here on today. Before I let you go, I want to give you an opportunity to tell folks how they can connect with you and how they can explore any of the work that you're currently doing, or to get a better understanding of your position.
Well, first, May 19th belongs to Malcolm. I want folks to, whatever they can do to enjoy and appreciate Malcolm's legacy on that day. In New York, my organization for years did much to big up and expand and make an international event, the annual gravesite pilgrimage to Malcolm's gravesite. Now, we're still under COVID restrictions at the Ferncliff Cemetery when Malcolm and Betty are buried, right? So there won't be a pilgrimage this year, just as there wasn't last year. But the ceremony will take place, right? Baba James Small and Ronnell Collins, Malcolm's baby cousin, and Sister Ella's son, will do a private ceremony that will be live streamed, right? I want everybody in Facebook land to go to the Malcolm X Commemoration Committee Facebook page. Like that page, and on that page is a link for an event that was put together as they do that in social media for the ceremony to the gravesite, right? Later on in the day at 12:30 in Harlem on 125th Street and Old Broadway, there will be a rededication press conference for a mural that was done dedicated to Malcolm and to Yuri Kuchiyama, right? This is a moment of Afro-Asian solidarity. Malcolm was a big agent of Afro-Asian solidarity. Message to the Grassroots, the Bandung Conference was a big coming together that took place in Indonesia. That's a way over another side of the world in Asia, where the Asian forces of independence were lending themselves to a broader, the beginnings of what was now referred to as the non-aligned movement. And hatefully, unfortunately, there's a wave of anti-Asian racism that is coming at folks as a consequence of the former president espousing Chinese origins to COVID-19 that have gotten people hurt, right? Not just on all levels, from January 6th to Congress to on the streets, the elders being beaten up, on the streets by people out of their mind with this racism. As a gesture of Afro-Asian solidarity, this mural was rededicated. Yuri Kuchiyama shares a birthday with Malcolm, right? She joined Malcolm in the Organization of Afro-American Unity. She was an emerging legend in the nuclear disarmament movement. She's Japanese, right? She came out of the U.S. concentration camps, right? Organizing like all get out. And when she passed away in 93, she was a legend in international human solidarity, like her little brother Malcolm X was. So this is dedicated to both of them. That's 12:30 that day. 1 o'clock, we shut down 125th Street. We've been doing that for over 30 years, right? For Malcolm. And later on that day, the Shabazz Center will do something at 6 o'clock. We're waiting for details on that. Fred Hampton will join my comrades in the December 12th movement. They'll be at a church in Brooklyn celebrating Malcolm on that day. So that day is huge. The day before, Mumia Abu Jamal, I will be hosting for the committee a book celebration for Mumia's last book. Mumia put together a 3-volume book series along with a filmmaker by the name of Stephen Vittoria. Stephen is a filmmaker from Newark, New Jersey, who gave us a film on Mumia called Long Distance Revolutionary. The film was banned in Newark, shown all over the world, but we had to protest the banning of it in Newark. Steve and Mumia put a book series together that rivals and may even eclipse Howard Zinn's legendary People's History of the United States. The 3rd volume was just published. It was overshadowed by Mumia's recent near-death illness, right? I want to thank everybody from the local community to the international community that raised hell to get Mumia the medical treatment that he needed. Mumia is still here, but Mumia needs to be free, as do the rest of his comrades. So on May 18th, again, come back to the Malcolm X Facebook page. We'll be doing a Facebook Live treatment and appreciation of Mumia, of the 3rd volume of Mumia's Murder Incorporated, a history of the imperialist dimensions of the United States history. So it's 6 o'clock. It's something I want everybody to appreciate. So for me, the Malcolm X Commemoration Committee Facebook page. If you try and get me on Facebook at Baba Zayid, I have 4,999 friends. You're too late.
Well, again, thanks for joining us today. I am certain that we will be.
I wish this was live. I wish this was in Plainfield.
In person.
I can put my hands on you and you know, I can grab the young and grab the elders the way I like to when I'm doing these kind of talks, because they're important. I stand on the shoulders of my little sister Annette Austin, who gave you a stellar presentation a few weeks ago on Harriet Tubman, using Harriet Tubman as a paradigm to talk about reparations. It was a stellar presentation. So y'all keep these things going. You have resources in us. You can call on us anytime you want to. I'm volunteering the net. You know, she asked for that, right? But you know, that's how we get down. You know,
right.
So I really appreciate and really honored and very humbled that you would even have me. I thank you very much.
Thank you again. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. A few echoing sentiments that I would like to express are that as a people, the diaspora of Black Americans or Black peoples across the world, if we are not careful with giving way to complacency or conformity to the diminishment of the struggles of our people, we will indeed allow ourselves to be erased. It is what we stand for at Frontiers International Plainfield Area Club, advancement through service. We find it to be necessary in our mission to empower and engage young people, Black Americans all across this country, but more locally, of course, in the Plainfield, New Jersey area, to empower them to not only gain access to the tools necessary for their personal success, but to equip them with knowledge and understanding to prepare them for the fight that continues to lie ahead. Because we are faced with tremendous amount of opposition as a people, and it is our responsibility as the adults and the leaders in our communities to make sure that we pass the baton in an effective way to not only prepare our young people, again, for their personal and isolated success, but with an understanding that there is no success if not for community empowerment. Thank you again for joining us today. As we mentioned earlier, if you would like to join us in our mission to provide advancement through service, you can do so by donating to our scholarship fund. That is available for your use through Zelle using the phone number 732 470 4207 or by PayPal to our treasurer's email address, just.marshall@verizon.net. Or you may mail a check made payable to Plainfield Frontiers at P.O. Box 428, Plainfield, New Jersey, 07061. Again, I thank you for joining us today. I thank you for participating in this rich discussion. I encourage you to come back, like the page, share this broadcast with others, share the page with others, and follow us so that you can keep abreast of all that we have going on, both live streaming through a broadcast and in our communities on a weekly basis. Thank you again for joining us. I pray that the day ahead for you will be one that is remarkable, rewarding, and enriching. As always, we are Frontiers International Plainfield Area Club. Peace.